We're going to take a look at sector planning now. And sectors are just simply the effect of outside energies on our site. So when we're thinking about these sectors, we can more or less just think of the really simple conceptual picture of our zone map where it was all just concentric circles and not worry too much about the fancy edges because that's all going to work itself out. And when we're looking at these sectors, there's quite a few different components that we're going to take into consideration. And there are things that we probably already somewhat think about, but it really helps to have them drawn out so that you can see all of them at once and really kind of start to put a lot of this information all together. So one of the biggest effects on our property is going to be the sun itself. Now, as we saw earlier on in the sections, when we're trying to orient our design, we're trying to face ourselves towards the sun's energy, so that we have a better understanding of where all of that energy is coming from. So this is going to feel a little bit backwards at first. You will get used to it, but in this case, we're going to be looking at the sectors in the northern hemisphere. So south will be at the top. So the sun is going to be coming around this way through the sky. So this is east, and this is west, and this is north. So one thing that we need to really pay attention to when we're looking at the sun's path is that in the summertime, so I'm going to draw the summer sun angles first. So in the summertime, we have our sun rising slightly to the northeast of our house, and then it's going to be coming around midday, and it's going to set slightly to the northwest of us. So this here would be what's known as the summer sun sector. And then we need to look at how is this sun path and sun angles, how are these going to change when we have the winter sun? So here where we are, 50 degrees north latitude, our winter sun has a very small, it just barely basically kind of comes up above the horizon, goes to about 16 degrees midday, and then sets again. And its path, I'm going to do this in blue maybe. So the winter sun path is going to rise about here, and it's going to set about here. So just to keep in mind the fact that we're going to have a lot more sun shining in all different places in the summertime and a lot less in the winter. So this is just the consideration of the sun sector alone. And the time when these maximum and minimum sun angles are the most important is especially when you're designing things like the overhang on your house. If you're looking at designing a passive solar house, for example, if the overhang on your house is not properly calculated, what you want it to do is you want it to let in the winter sun. So when the sun is low in the sky, you want it to come in and hit the windows of the house. And when the sun is in the summertime, you want it to hit the overhang and not shine into your house. So you need to take into account all of the variations in your sun angles in order to design your buildings accordingly to be able to block the sun. It's also important when you figure out how far away to plant tall trees, because if you want them to shade your house, you need to know those angles to be able to figure out whether it's going to cast the shade in the areas that you want or not. So you need to know these angles in order to figure out how tall these trees should be and how far away they should be planted to shade or not shade your house, depending on what it is that you're looking at. So sometimes it's easiest to simply stand on the property and see where the sun rises and where the sun sets. I am very fortunate where I am on my farm because I can see 360 degrees around me. So it's very obvious to me where the sun rises and sun sets. And actually my neighbors have a beautiful archway over their lane entrance. And towards midsummer, when the sun is setting towards the northwest, it actually sets where it's framed right in their archway from my house. And that doesn't happen all the time, obviously, because the sun is rising and setting in a different spot throughout the year. But it's kind of interesting that in midsummer it's setting through their archway of their lane, and in the winter it's setting on the other side of their house entirely. And so I really notice it, especially out here where I can see the sun from the second it comes up to the second that it goes down. It's not hiding behind anything. I really notice a lot more those kind of patterns. So we can use this sun sector to our advantage. So we can figure out if we want to plant deciduous trees or not. And that's usually dependent on how far away from an ocean you are, is whether you have really hot summers and really cold winters, or whether it's kind of more stable temperature all year round. So another sector that we want to look at is the wind sector. So if I'm looking at the example of Regina, Saskatchewan, so where we are, historically all the wind goes in this direction. So it comes from the northwest all the time, or from the southeast the other parts of the time. So about half the time it's coming from the northwest, and the other half of the time it's coming from the southeast. The only time that I've noticed that it ever blows straight from the east or straight from the west is if it's blowing at 100 kilometers an hour. The only time that it blows 100 kilometers an hour is when it's coming straight from the east or straight from the west. It's really kind of interesting. I haven't noticed any times at all where the wind has come in this direction at all. I think the only time that may happen is when a tornado is actually blowing through my property, or there's some sort of really interesting weather event that's going on, like perhaps a Chinook coming through in the winter where suddenly it's +6 outside or something. But in that case, it's probably blowing at 100K straight through my property as well. So we look at where the wind is coming to be able to use that to our advantage to plant windbreaks. So in the situation of a cold climate, we're going to want to plant a lot of windbreaks to the northwest to make sure that that cold winter wind isn't just beating on our house constantly. And so the next thing that we look at, and this isn't as relevant necessarily in a lot of parts of Canada as it is, say, in California, or, well, I guess in BC now it is you want to look at fire sectors as well. Is there any potential for fire to spread onto your property from outside of your property? So let's say that there's a really, really dry, overgrown field just to the southwest of you. Then we want to indicate on our sector diagram that there's the potential here for a fire sector. So we want to make a note if that's ever a possibility, because when we know that there's a possibility that fire could come in, we don't want to spend 5 years and tens of thousands of dollars landscaping our property and putting everything in, only just to have a fire come through and wipe out all of our hard work. So we need to look at whether or not fire is going to be very common where we are, and if it is, we need to protect against it in some way. So whether that is planting like just putting up even a bunch of sandbags there, something to kind of prevent it from kind of coming further, whether it's putting in a water feature that is going to slow it down. We just really need to take a look at that as well. And if there's any hot, dry winds that happen in your area where there is a risk of a fire, then you need to add them in as well, because that can just fuel it, obviously, as well. Another thing that we want to include as well is our views. So maybe from your house, you have a really, really excellent view in this direction. Maybe you look out over a beautiful valley and you get to see a lot of wildlife there. So we want to make sure that we know that this section here is a good view. So we don't want to block that any more than we have to. So if we want to block wind or something, we want to make sure that we're doing so in a way that we're not going to destroy that really good view that we have. And on the same note, we want to make sure that we are blocking bad views at the same time. So perhaps there is a view out in this direction here where we see the side of our neighbor's hideous house and his yard is covered in trash, and they're also very noisy and everything. Then we want to be able to put a block up on this side so that we don't see those bad views. Another thing that we want to take into consideration with our sectors is pollution. Now, the pollution can be either from noise or dust or smell. Maybe you're next to a factory and you don't want all those smells constantly coming into your property either. Then perhaps we notice that there's some pollution in this direction. Maybe it's really noisy in this direction. Maybe there's a lot of smell. So we want to make sure that we know about that as well. There's also the possibility that there could be, just looking for another color here. There's a possibility too that, especially in colder climates, that you could have early frost perhaps in some regions. So there might be a river kind of, or a little valley coming through, and you get a bunch of early frost down there. So maybe you don't want to plant any sensitive plants down in that valley, for example. Or alternatively, if that early frost happens everywhere except for in that valley, then maybe you want to plant plants in there that are frost sensitive as well. This could also be indicating a flood zone that might be present as well. So in the example of my property, I have a little spring-fed creek that goes down through a valley in my property. And year-round, it's about, a foot to 18 inches wide. And that is most of the year, except there's 1 week in the spring where we get all the runoff, and it's about 45 feet wide. So there's a huge difference between how it normally looks and what happens during one event every year. My neighbors didn't plan for this on the other side of where I am, and they had actually used a flatbed from a semi-trailer to make a bridge across their part of the valley and their part of the creek. And they didn't realize the volume and the power of the water that was going to be coming through in the springtime. And now that trailer is lodged down in my other neighbor's part of the valley, and there's no way we're getting that thing out because it's really wedged in there. So we do need to take into account if there's any flooding that occurs quite regularly, or there's a possibility of a lot of flooding that could occur. So there are a lot of different factors that we want to look into when we're looking at all the energies that are on the site. All of these energies affect the site, and quite a few of them pass through the site. So the wind, for example, although it seems like it's constant some days, it's bringing new dust or nutrients through our property constantly. So this is where it's very beneficial to get out onto the land and start observing a lot of these things. We need to ask the homeowner or others in the area for information, and we need to look at historical weather data. And there's a lot of things that will give us indications about some of these factors. So without looking up weather data, you can typically tell which direction the wind comes from by looking at the trees in the area. So there's something that's known as wind shearing of trees in a prevailing area. So if you have a bunch of trees in a particular area, and they're shaped more or less like an airplane's wing is kind of shaped, then the wind is probably coming from this direction. That's the reason why airplane wings are shaped the way they are, is to help the wind pass over them. So typically you'll see this kind of height variation that looks almost like the cross-section of an airplane wing that will tell you that the wind is coming from that direction. There are some really good examples of trees in our particular area. I know in the town of Lumsden nearby, it's down in a valley, and there's a whole bunch of elm trees that are ancient. They're probably about 110 years old, which in our area is really old for trees. And each one of the trees on the street they're massive, massive, massive trees, like probably 10-foot diameter trunks. But on the street, as you go down the street, they are all leaning all towards the southeast, because the wind from the northwest has been so strong over the years that it's actually bent all of the trees all in the same direction. And it actually looks kind of impressive that they're even standing. They're really at quite an angle, quite a few of them. It might not be as difficult to find some of this information as you think either. You can find a lot of this information online through Environment Canada, or MateoBlue.com is a really good resource as well. And there's windtracker.com. There's a whole bunch of different websites where you can find a lot of this local information. But one of the easiest ways to figure out if there's floods or fires or extreme weather events is just to talk to local people. I am going to generalize slightly, because I mean, it's kind of typical of people when they age. So if you're looking at grandparents, for example, or the elderly, they love to talk about the weather because they have seen a lot of different weather events. And if you ask them about really rare weather events, they can tell you the coldest winter they experienced. They can tell you the winter with the most snowfall. And they will tell you the year when it flooded. And they'll talk about how many years there was a drought. And they remember a lot of these very extreme weather events. And it's really beneficial to talk to a lot of the locals about this, because they will remember these one-time events that might be very useful to you when you're designing things. It's kind of interesting that nowadays, now that we're relying on technology so heavily, and we're spending a lot of our lives indoors as a society, that most people aren't aware of these things the same way that we have been historically. Throughout time, if you think about before electric light, or when we were quite nomadic people and moving around a lot, I guarantee that at any point in time, those people could tell you what cycle the moon was in, and they could tell you about whereabouts the sun rises and sets in the sky, and all of those kind of things. And nowadays, I've kind of toyed around with this a little bit, and I've asked some of my customers, well, what side of the house does the sun come up on your property? And most of them don't know the answer. And I find it really kind of interesting that now we don't know like which side of the house gets the late day sun, which side of the house gets the early morning sun. We're so out of touch with a lot of these things that we're not paying attention to them anymore. And that's where a lot of people fail when they're trying to design their yards, is that they're just completely unaware of a lot of these factors. They don't know which way the wind normally blows from. And so in order to get our designs right and to be extremely efficient, we need to factor all of those energies in. And once you know that all of these things exist, that there are good views and bad views and pollution from noise and dust and the sun and the wind and all of these kind of things, then all we need to do is decide whether we want to trap or repel a lot of these energies. So we want to know whether we want to invite something in, like a good view, or whether we want to block it out, like a bad smell. So it's a simple yes or no to each one of these factors. So to try and do this a little bit in a visual way. So there's the winter sun, there's the summer sun. Want that going around just a little bit further. So if that's the sun, and that's the sun, and then if we have the good view here, and we have the bad view here, and we have the wind coming this way, and maybe we don't have a fire sector, but even just using these elements here, it becomes really quite easy to start designing this, because all we need to do is go through each one of these things and we want to say, yes, we want the winter sun. No, we do not want the summer sun shining on our house. No, we do not want the bad view. Yes, we do want the good view. Yes, we want the wind that is coming from the southwest. And no, we do not want the wind that's coming from the northwest. And so on and so forth. So you can go around and start factoring in what we want to block and what we want to come into our properties and our designs. So it looks really simple, but these are very important decisions, because they are something that, although we can't control the fact that the sun rises and sets every day, we can control how it's going to affect our property if we do this right. So we can look for microclimates in a lot of these situations. We can create them this way. We can look at when this isn't designed properly. We see things like wind tunneling in suburbs. I've never been there, but I've been told that New York City is really quite windy a lot of the time, and it gets a lot of that wind tunneling effect. That it hasn't been a really good job of kind of blocking the wind. I know that was a little bit of a concern in our old football stadium as well, was the way that it was situated. It acted like a wind tunnel, and it was just constantly so windy in there. So as long as we take all these things into consideration and block what we don't want and invite in what we do want, our designs are going to work out really quite well.